Well, EJ, thank you for joining us today. We're so grateful that you're here with us and going to be able to share with us what is happening really on the streets of downtown Toronto. So, EJ, one of the first things that stood out when we connected was your passion for reaching people right where they are. So for those that are watching, could you share a brief overview of what you do as an urban missionary working directly in neighborhoods to impact people's lives?
So that's actually one of the most fascinating questions I get asked. What's a typical day like in an urban missionary's life? And the answer is there is no typical day. Every day is a mixed bag of random things. And I think this is just an echo of how the Holy Spirit works. I'll give you an example. I have one day where I used to run a prison ministry. So I'd go to jail in the morning, and then I would meet up with a social worker in the afternoon, and then I had a meeting with my MP in the late afternoon, and then a board meeting at a community center that I'm on the board for. So I even think of other days where when I used to work in other at Young Street Mission, I'd start my day running the drop in. I'd wear a suit because I needed to go to a CAS meeting, and then I get back and have to clean up puke. Someone puked on the stairs. So every day is a fascinating adventure and a great surprise.
Yeah, and that was when we talked, it was one of the things that I noticed. You're like, I do life with people, and life is messy. And so you're in that with them, whether that's the good days, the bad days, the messy days. And that's really what being an urban missionary is about, being there in the middle of that with people. So what motivates you to live among and engage directly with unreached and marginalized populations?
Well, I'm mostly governed by some Jesus guy who said talked about the greatest commandment being loving God and loving our neighbors. And it's quite fascinating to me how that second portion of that, Jesus didn't actually qualify as a lesser thing to do, but is actually equal to the first. And so a lot of what I do is really premised with caring for neighbors. And then the question is, when Jesus was confronted by the teacher of the law, who is your neighbor? And so we have a very wide definition of who is our neighbor. So to us, our neighbor is the people who panhandle on the street, and just like the affluent neighbors in my community, they all matter to us. And then I also think about Matthew 25 when Jesus tells the story of the sheep and the goats. It's a very famous passage for people doing street ministry. When Jesus says, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. And essentially, Jesus was saying, whatever you did to the least of these, you've done for me. And the one reflection I've had from that passage is I get to see the face of Christ every time I serve people in the margins. And so as much as we worship in church and sing songs, as an extension of my expression of worship, serving people in the margins is also an altar for me. It's an altar for me and my family, and living in our neighborhood is also our primary thing. John Perkins talked about this thing that's called the 3 R's. So relocation and redemption and basically being postured as a neighbor, living where we are, caring for those in the margins. This is how we express our faith as a family and how I express my ministry as an urban missionary here in the city.
I love it. Well, thank you for the work that you do. Can you share a story or experience that illustrates the impact of your work?
Oh, I've got so many stories. But I remember one funny one. I was walking with a church group around downtown. I do these things called street walks. I don't publicize that too much because I don't want to do them all the time because I want to just spend time with people. But sometimes I indulge and I essentially use the city as a classroom. And so this church group was walking alongside of me, and for some reason, I just felt the inkling to walk down George Street. I don't often walk down that street. It's the highest crime density in the province, one of the highest crime density areas in Canada. But for some reason, I just felt like the Holy Spirit was leading us to walk there, and I ran into someone I knew, and I've known him a long time, known him 17 years, and he's a young guy who's wrestled with a lot of trauma and addictions. And I guess I caught him at his lowest of lows.
Mm.
He was staying at Seton House, which is not the greatest shelter in the world, and he was just looking the most disheveled I've ever seen him. And when I chatted with him, I found out that he has estranged himself from his ex girlfriend at that time now, or still now, and also his son. And as he said that, I kind of felt a nudge from the Holy Spirit to say, "Hey, EJ, I think that's something you got to work on." And we work really hard to start dealing with his trauma and his addictions, and it took us about 8 months of advocating, even with the court, to see him reconnect with his son. And I remember when we finally got to that point, he actually started by seeing me and handing over his beers and said, like, I was going to drink today because I was so anxious. But he said, I can't be drinking if I'm gonna see my son. Hadn't seen his son in 2 years. And watching their reunion was so joyous.
Mm.
We had planned to go to a baseball game, and watching a father reconcile with his son just sent chills up my spine. I remember driving in the car, watching them both in the back, just marveling over reconnecting. And I'm like, man, what what an incredible thing I get to do. And he's still wrestling with some issues here and there, but the main thing is he gets to be a father. Actually, I just saw him last week. He's got some other things going on, but we're really trying to prioritize him being a present father. We're in the business of caring for orphans, so we don't. I don't want his son to be an orphan.
Mm. That's so good. Well,
Most
thank you, EJ.
beautiful thing.
That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story and the impact that you're having on the streets of Toronto, but also to encourage the church that you don't need to be an urban missionary to impact your neighbor. And so, if anybody's watching wants more information on the work that EJ is doing, you can go to 700club.ca. Well, thank you, EJ, for joining us today.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me.